Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we've stepped into a fascinating, really high altitude arena. You've shared a set of conceptual sources with us that are, well, they're less like research reports and more like a systematic philosophical proposal for a complete societal overhaul.
That's the perfect description. I mean, we are looking at a master plan, really, a theoretical outline for how individuals, communities, and governments should not just manage, but actually eliminate what the sources call negative phenomena.
Right. So here al-salbiya.
Exactly. So this isn't about specific current events. It's much bigger. It's about a deeply conceptual architecture for reform.
Okay, so let's unpack this and, set our mission for today. We're essentially charting a course through what looks like a three-layered strategy. First, the individual or spiritual response. Then there's the collective, sort of behavioral response. And finally, this absolute governmental and legal mandate.
A mandate, yes.
So our task is to map these distinct layers, right? To understand the total suggested strategy for eradicating negative behaviors. It's an incredibly ambitious mandate. I mean, it's proposing a pathway to societal perfection.
It truly is. The sources lay out a completely integrated system. The foundational belief here is that these phenomena, which, could be anything from everyday dishonesty all the way up to institutional corruption, they aren't permanent flaws in the human condition.
They're seen as solvable problems.
Solvable problems, exactly. But solving them requires this synchronized effort at every single level, using specific and sometimes even contradictory strategies. And I think we really need to dissect the nature of those contradictions today.
Absolutely. So let's start with that foundation. Let's begin with the scope. What actually constitutes a negative phenomenon in this framework? I mean, the term al-Zawahir al-Salbiya is so sweeping. If the remedies range from, private prayer all the way to state force, that suggests the term must cover basically everything.
Precisely. We have to view this as an all-encompassing term for anything that corrodes the health of an individual or a collective.
Okay.
Given that the sources explicitly addresses both individuals' sishosinia, the scope is maximal. It's as big as it gets.
So on a personal level, what might that be?
On a personal level, it might include moral failings like jealousy or, say, chronic deceit. But then on a societal level, it would certainly cover systemic injustice, large-scale fraud, political tyranny, maybe even environmental degradation.
So the rule is, if it causes harm and impedes the collective good, it falls under this umbrella.
It demands intervention, yes.
That immediately frames the entire exercise as a kind of diagnosis and cure for a societal illness. And the stakes must be incredibly high if the suggested cure involves such radical legal and personal mandates. What does the source say is the ultimate consequence of, failing to address these things?
Well, the consequence, and therefore the ultimate goal of the whole intervention, is framed in almost existential terms.
How so?
Addressing these phenomena is presented as essential for the liberation or salvation of individuals and nations. The term is igese hua.
Liberation. Wow, so that's far beyond mere improvement.
Oh, far beyond. It suggests that negative behaviors are a form of bondage. Spiritual, moral, political bondage. They hold people and nations captive. So the entire framework, therefore, is presented as a means to achieve genuine freedom and fulfillment.
So it's not about just making things a little better. It's not about marginal gains. It's about achieving full potential, completely unshackled by internal and external corruption.
Exactly.
That dramatically raises the urgency of this discussion. Okay, so let's move to the central mechanism that kicks this whole process off, which the source identifies as increased awareness, or agisi, anyway.
Right. This is the absolute starting gate. The source clearly asserts that increased awareness by the individual and states about negative phenomena is the central mechanism for dealing with them.
It's central.
The central one. If awareness is absent, any action, it doesn't matter how forceful, will ultimately fail.
But I want to introduce some friction here because, we live in a world that is saturated with information. We know intellectually that certain things are destructive, say widespread corruption in a bureaucracy. Knowledge marifa is abundant.
Sure.
So how does way differ from simple knowledge? Why is awareness the key that unlocks this whole system?
That is the most crucial distinction we can make. Marifa knowledge is static. It's information you've stored, like, knowing the definition of corruption from a textbook.
Okay.
Way, however, it translates better as a state of deep, active realization, a visceral consciousness. It's the difference between knowing intellectually that a certain food is unhealthy and having a sudden, profound realization of how that food is actively diminishing your life force right here, right now.
Ah, I see. So Wei is the moment the intellectual understanding transforms into a moral conviction that actually demands action. It's the moment of internal accountability.
Precisely. And the source links this heightened way directly to the desired outcome.
The disappearance of the phenomenon. Not the reduction, the disappearance.
The disappearance. If a person or a state achieves true way about the corrosive nature of, say, systemic deceit, that deceit is fundamentally undermined. It can no longer be justified internally or externally. The individual's behavior changes because the behavior has lost its intellectual and moral ground.
This means the negative phenomena can only thrive when they're obscured or rationalized or just accepted as the way things are.
Yes.
But once the light of this deep way is shone upon them, they become unsustainable.
They become unsustainable. But this also means that the awareness has to be comprehensive. It has to encompass not just the existence of the negative behavior, but its mechanism of operation and its full destructive impact.
Right.
Exactly. For a state to tackle, for example, social division, it's not enough to know that people disagree. The state must achieve a way about how division is leveraged, who benefits from it, and how it actively prevents the nation's liberation.
And only then can it act.
Only then can the state implement the forceful, structural remedies we'll get into later. Way is the intellectual prerequisite for the dramatic action that follows. Without it, you are just treating symptoms. You're not dissolving the root cause. This way is the internal fuel for the external mandates of respect, ignorance, force, and critically exposure.
Let's dedicate a moment to the practical side of this. If I, as an individual, want to apply this framework to overcome a personal negative habit, say chronic procrastination, the sources are telling me the first step isn't a new time management technique.
Not at all.
It's achieving way. It's a deep, painful, unavoidable realization of how that procrastination is actively stealing my life and my potential.
Yes. The initial focus is spiritual and psychological, not mechanical. You have to confront the habit viscerally. And the source suggests that once that true realization hits, the subsequent strategies, the action components, they become automatic and motivated rather than forced and temporary.
Because the phenomenon has been internally identified as a non-negotiable enemy.
An enemy of one's own liberation. And once that foundation is set, then we can move to the actions required by the individual and the people.
Okay, so if awareness is the spark, then the individual response is the immediate blaze. And this is where the sources get structurally complex. They offer two paths that, on the surface at least, seem to pull the individual in opposite directions.
They really do.
Let's look at strategy one, the path of direct engagement.
Right. Strategy one demands a radical pairing of actions when you're dealing with negative phenomena in a communal setting. Respect and exposure shaming, the negative behavior.
This is the definition of a moral tightrope. I mean, how can any individual maintain respect for a person or a situation while simultaneously engaging in what the translation calls shaming their behavior? It risks coming across as utterly hypocritical or worse, manipulative.
We have to pause here. We have to spend significant time on this duality because it is the core ethical challenge of the individual response. The sources are forcing us to create a kind of surgical distinction between the actor and the action. Okay. The instruction to maintain respect ensures that the intervention isn't rooted in contempt or personal grievance. It's an acknowledgement of inherent human dignity, maybe even the potential for redemption. You respect the person's existence, their place in the community, their inner value.
But then the moment you do that, the second half of the mandate kicks in. Exposure. The instruction is to shine a harsh public light on the slugalsalvia, the negative conduct.
Correct. The focus has to be relentlessly on the behavior itself. So if we take the example of workplace gossip, the individual following this strategy does not attack the gossiper as a malicious person. They would maintain a respectful demeanor towards their colleague. However, they aggressively expose the act of gossip. Its falsehoods, its destructive consequences, its inherent negativity making it visible and morally untenable in that communal space.
That sounds incredibly difficult to execute in practice. I mean, how do you expose a behavior without the target feeling personally attacked and humiliated?
That is the test of the strategy. The source implies that the respect acts as a constant safeguard against the exposure devolving into pure cruelty or, a personal vendetta.
I see.
If the exposure is done with genuine respect for the actor's dignity, it transforms the act into one of moral intervention rather than social destruction. It shifts accountability from a private whispered thing to a public communal necessity. It's essentially a form of tough, necessary love.
So if the intervention is perceived as an act of liberation, freeing the community and potentially the individual from the behavior, then the respect part is maintained.
Right?
But if it becomes a tool for superiority or malice, the strategy has failed because the respect component was violated.
Absolutely. The exposure, the fatty hat, creates social pressure. But because it's tethered to Iram, respect, that pressure is ideally therapeutic. It allows the community to reject the phenomenon while still holding space for the individual's future positive contribution. This is fundamentally different from, say, cancel culture, which often seeks to erase the person entirely.
Right. This framework seeks to erase only the behavior.
Only the behavior.
Let's apply this to a higher stakes scenario. What about confronting systemic corruption within a local government? The source mandates respect and exposure. How do those two coexist there?
The individual must expose the precise mechanism of corruption, the specific bribes, the misused funds, the policy failures. That's the exposure part. But the accompanying respect requires the individual to treat the office and even the corrupted official with a certain legal dignity during the process. You don't burn down the institution out of spite. You expose the flaw in the name of the institution's proper functioning. This maintains legitimacy while still demanding accountability.
That requires immense maturity and focus. It's a powerful demand for a kind of targeted moral precision.
But wait, we have a second strategy for the individual, which seems like a complete rejection of engagement.
Yes,
Strategy 2 is purely internal and spiritual.
it is. The source offers an alternative path for the individual, particularly when direct engagement or confrontation might be counterproductive or just too draining. Total ignorance.
Total ignorance.
This is the withdrawal strategy, and it's coupled with praying to God, Saitu Iksan, which is described as the best solution for lifting negative phenomena.
Total ignorance. If the phenomenon is a societal toxin, doesn't ignoring it simply allow it to flourish? This seems to run contrary to the foundational urgency we established in Section 1.
It is a critical challenge, and we have to interpret Tajahul al-Tam total ignorance, not as denial, but as a resource management tactic.
Okay, a tactic. Think of it as intellectual self-preservation. When you're facing trivial conflicts or relentless emotional noise or behaviors that are deeply entrenched and just beyond your immediate capacity to correct, the strategy says, protect your energy. Refuse to engage emotionally or intellectually, and by doing so, you deny the phenomenon the power of your attention and your time.
So I protect my internal space, I refuse the emotional drain, and I redirect that energy into spiritual conviction, the prayer, which assumes the problem is now being handled by a higher power. It's a profound shift in where I place my agency.
Exactly. The ignorance is a boundary. It's a refusal to be contaminated by trivial negativity. The prayer is the ultimate affirmation of what you're acknowledging the problem exists, but you're deferring the solution to the most powerful force possible. And that frees the individual from the burden of direct confrontation, where that confrontation is futile or, low value.
But here is the remarkable overlap. This is the critical synthesis. Even when recommending total spiritual ignorance, the source still mandates the exposure shaming of the negative behavior.
To free people.
This is the unifying principle of the individual response. It's unavoidable. Whether you engage directly with respect, as in Strategy 1, or you withdraw spiritually, as in Strategy 2, the requirement to make the negative action visible is absolute. The individual is never permitted to let the phenomenon remain hidden. So the confrontation method is flexible, but the moral obligation to create visibility is constant.
Constant.
I can choose to ignore the gossip for my personal peace, but I must still ensure that the act of gossiping is publicly recognized as a negative phenomenon.
This clarifies the inherent tension. Strategy 1 is for when the negative phenomenon is immediate, high impact, and requires your presence for correction. Strategy 2 is for when the phenomenon is distant, repetitive, or personally draining.
But in both cases.
In both cases, the individual's way is translated into the public visibility of the flaw, which is the necessary condition for societal liberation. The moment the individual fails to expose the behavior, they are complicit in allowing the bondage to continue.
Let's summarize the synthesis here then. If the source demands both respect and exposure and also offers ignorance and exposure, the core takeaway is that liberation is achieved by making the flaw visible. And the individual's choice lies in whether they manage that visibility through active, respectful engagement or through a kind of spiritual, passive withdrawal.
You could suggest that the sources provide a sophisticated moral compass for when to fight and when to retreat, but always insisting on the light being shown. You must never let the negative behavior hide in the shadows of indifference or personal fear. And that visibility is the starting point for Section 3, where the government steps in.
Okay, so we shift now from the dynamic, nuanced realm of individual conscience to the rigid structure of the state. If the individual is asked to exercise moral precision, the government is mandated to use, well, brute force. The state can't afford the ambiguity of total ignorance.
The sources mandate a completely different operational approach for the government. Governments must confront negative phenomena strongly and forcefully,
Strongly and forcefully.
which implies state mechanisms have to be proactive and uncompromising. This requires the immediate, decisive implementation of rulings to address the issues that individuals have identified and exposed.
So force here means the full weight of the legal, the penal, the executive systems. The state's role is to act as the institutional consequence for the negative behavior that the community's way has identified and exposed.
That's it.
It's a massive jump from moral persuasion to legal coercion.
It is. If the individual's exposure is the pressure gauge, the government's force is the release valve. This framework doesn't envision a weak or morally hesitant state. It needs a state powerful enough to override vested interests, corruption, and systemic flaws without any compromise. The government must be the ultimate non-negotiable guarantor of societal health.
But this forceful confrontation has to be guided by a clear principle. And here we find the most challenging, profound, and unique concept in these sources. The central pillar of the entire governmental response is the implementation of the law of respect. Say CAC other.
This concept is truly revolutionary in a legal sense, and we need to slow down to fully grasp its implications. The source states that governments must implement rulings for respect between individuals and states, and the goal is absolute.
What's the goal?
The disappearance of all negative phenomena this gaze try to keep.
Wait. If the goal is the disappearance of all negative phenomena, from corruption to interpersonal slights, by legally enforcing respect, then respect isn't just a virtue the state encourages. It is the fundamental, highest law of the land. It's the source code of the entire legal system. But what does it mean to legally enforce respect? I mean, how do you even measure a violation?
That's the intellectual puzzle this framework presents. It goes far beyond existing anti-slander or anti-discrimination laws, which deal with specific, measurable harms. The law of respect appears to establish a legally mandated level of dignity and proper regard for every human entity, including the state itself.
Okay, let's explore the legal implications of that. Would violating the law of respect be a civil offense, a criminal offense? If I disrespect my neighbor, say, I intentionally spread a hurtful but technically non-slanderous rumor, how does the law of respect process that?
Well, it suggests the legal system would have to develop metrics for assessing intent and the quality of an interaction, not just measurable financial or physical harm. A violation of the law of respect could be an act of contempt, an expression of disdain, or a failure to grant appropriate dignity, which might not be a crime today, but under this framework, it's an attack on the foundational social contract.
I can see how corruption would fall under this. Corruption is a supreme act of disrespect for public trust and for collective resources. But what about something softer, like a lack of common courtesy? Or even biting satire?
Right.
If the law of respect is absolute, it risks legislating thought and regulating every single interpersonal dynamic.
That is the necessary tension. The framework accepts the risk that enforcement requires immense power, but it argues that this power is necessary because the stakes are societal liberation. If disrespect is the root of all negative phenomena, if every crime, every ethical lapse is traceable back to a failure to respect the dignity of the other, the collective, or the law, then eliminating disrespect must eliminate all those phenomena.
So the state transforms from a reactive police force into a proactive guarantor of dignity. It doesn't just prosecute thieves. It prosecutes the underlying lack of respect for property rights and trust that makes theft possible in the first place.
And this framework extends the law of respect beyond individual citizens to the state itself, because the source mandates rulings between individuals and states.
Oh, that's interesting.
It is. This suggests that a government's failure to provide justice, or to practice transparency, or to honor treaties is a violation of the law of respect, demanding the same forceful confrontation the state applies to its citizens. This implies a powerful system of internal and international accountability enforced by the very same principle.
So it's a system where virtue is legally compelled, and it requires immense non-passive strength, which reinforces that initial instruction for forceful confrontation. So how does the government manage the tension of being forceful, yet perfectly respectful?
The force is directed purely toward the enforcement of respect. The government must enforce the law of respect respectfully. For instance, if an individual is punished for a violation of the law of respect, the punishment itself must maintain the dignity of the punished, focusing only on the elimination of the negative behavior and the restoration of societal respect. This is the difference between punitive cruelty and restorative justice based on a single high principle.
And finally, we see the absolute institutional validation of the individual's moral work. The government's third function is to actively integrate the citizen's effort.
Yes.
The government must assist individuals in exposing negative behavior.
What the station? What is this work about your philocty?
This ma'am colloca were both the government must assist individuals in exposing negative behavior. If I achieve way and I expose corruption using strategy 1 or 2, the government is legally mandated to provide mechanisms for me.
Like what?
Robust whistleblower protection, immediate and impartial investigation, and validation to ensure my active exposure leads directly to the state's forceful implementation of the law of respect.
So this creates a fully integrated cycle.
A complete cycle. The individual's moral consciousness, the way, identifies the threat. That threat is made public through exposure. And the state immediately translates that public knowledge into legally mandated consequences using force and the law of respect.
Right. It ensures the community's awareness is not just a moral sentiment, but a functional lever for legal change.
The state, in effect, deputizes the conscience of the citizen.
It does. The citizen exposes the flaw, and the state promises to use its overwhelming force not for arbitrary power, but only to uphold the supreme legal principle of respect.
So we've dissected the individual strategies, the spiritual strategies, and the legal mandates. Now we have to bring them all together by examining the one action that is non-negotiable at every single level: exposure, or omöjlighet.
This concept is the thread that runs through the entire framework. It's the universal catalyst that translates the internal desire for change into external reality.
Okay, let's review where this exposure is mandated, because its recurrence is the single most important detail in this whole thing. So first,
Individual and peoples. Strategy 1, respect plus exposure.
right. And then individual strategy 2, the spiritual one, ignorance and prayer plus exposure.
Scholar.
And finally, the government. Strong confrontation, law of respect, plus helping individuals with exposure. It's everywhere.
It's the bridge. Awareness way is worthless if it remains private. Action against a phenomenon is impossible if the phenomenon is not visible.
Right.
By mandating exposure at every level, from the citizen who sees a private wrong to the state that must publicly validate it, the sources ensure that the negative behavior has nowhere left to hide. It is forced into the moral and legal spotlight.
So if I fail to expose a negative behavior, I'm actually committing 2 wrongs under this framework. First, I'm betraying my own liberation by allowing the behavior to persist. And second, I'm actively sabotaging the state's ability to implement the law of respect because the law can only be applied to that which is visible.
That is the weight of the moral mandate. Exposure is not optional. It is the necessary pressure point. It activates the community's collective way and, crucially, provides a factual basis for the government to initiate its forceful implementation of rulings. It ensures that the negative behavior is made unviable. It simply cannot thrive under the light of public scrutiny and the threat of legal consequence.
So let's discuss the ultimate mechanics of liberation here, of A&A. How does the act of exposure, coupled with the law of respect, physically eliminate these negative phenomena?
Well, think of it structurally. Negative phenomena are often defined by secrecy, by rationalization, and by social tolerance.
Okay.
Exposure destroys all three. Once a negative behavior is exposed, it loses its protective shroud of secrecy. It can no longer be rationalized because the community's shared way has been activated. And crucially, it loses social tolerance because the ultimate institutional authority, the government, is legally required to confront it forcefully under the banner of the law of respect.
So if the law of respect functions as intended, the moment an act of disrespect, which is a negative phenomenon, is exposed, the legal consequence is automatic and non-negotiable.
It should be.
It creates an environment where negative behavior is metabolically impossible.
It creates an absolute accountability cycle. This vision requires a society to prioritize dignity and respect so highly that any deviation is treated as a foundational crisis, demanding immediate, unified intervention from the conscience of the individual all the way up to the force of the state.
Wow.
The entire framework seeks not moderation, but the complete disappearance of flaws through legally mandated visible virtue.
This has been an extraordinarily complex deep dive into a framework that attempts to legislate not just order, but virtue itself. So let's quickly synthesize the core architecture presented in these sources.
Okay, at the core, everything starts with deep awareness.
Right, the spark.
That awareness activates the dual response of the individual, either respectful engagement or spiritual ignorance.
Two paths.
Two paths, but both of them feed into the central action of exposure.
Which then triggers the state.
Exactly. That exposure triggers the state's mandate for forceful confrontation, which is fundamentally rooted in the supreme legal authority of the law of respect.
Sheshem. So the key takeaway, the non-negotiable demand, is that if you want liberation, if you want the negative phenomenon to disappear, you have to make the negative behavior visible. The entire moral and legal system is designed to respond to that active exposure.
This integrated approach aims to create a self-correcting society where the moral compass of the citizen provides the data and the legal system provides the uncompromising, dignity-focused enforcement. It's a proposal for a completely integrated moral and legal system focused on absolute societal liberation.
And here's the provocative thought for you to carry forward, because this framework demands we think about the nature of freedom versus mandated virtue. If the goal is the absolute elimination of negative behavior through the forceful enforcement of this law of respect, we have to consider the practical cost.
Right. If the state is powerful enough to define and enforce universal respect, regulating interactions to such a degree that all negative phenomena disappear, what happens to difference?
So our question for you, the listener, is this. If a society successfully implements the law of respect, making every interaction a matter of legal compliance and allowing the government to forcefully confront exposed disrespect, what is the ultimate fate of dissent, of challenging authority, or even of radical nonconformity?
If respect is legislated and enforced by state power, it is shifted from being a moral virtue, something freely chosen, to a mechanism of legal compliance, enforced through the threat of the state's powerful confrontation. Does true liberation lie in absolute, enforced societal cohesion, or does that level of legislative control stifle the very human creativity and divergence that drives progress?
What kind of society would that ultimate enforced liberation truly create? That is a fundamental question to wrestle with as you consider the sweeping power dynamics inherent in mandating both respect and exposure. We thank you for sharing these incredible sources and letting us unpack this immense vision for societal reform.